Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're starting off with the very first episode of the new book that we will be discussing, The One Thing, by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. If you guys know Gary Keller is the chairman of the board and co-founder of Keller Williams Realty, which holds the number one position as the largest real estate company in the world. And Jay Papasan, former editor at HarperCollins Publishers, co-authors Gary Books, and is vice president of publishing at Keller Williams. This book was a number one Wall Street Journal bestseller. I'm just reading from what's on the book cover and the book flaps here, guys. But I read this book originally, I would say about four or 5 years ago, I think. About 4 years ago. And the principle in this book, I think, is so true and something that I've kind of have gotten away from a little bit because I have multiple things that I'm trying to work on, so to speak. But the book is going to talk about your one thing. And when you focus on your one thing, it makes everything else easier. Success breeds success. We're going to talk about that today. And everything just falls in line. So it's kind of along the lines with winning in mind, Four Agreements, kind of these personal self-development books. But I thought it'd be cool to do this with you guys. It's not that long of a book, so I thought this would be a fun read after coming off of 1984. And without further ado, let's just jump right into it. The One Thing, we're going to start off with the introduction. And Gary starts off by talking about this story where he's in a movie theater back in early 90s, and he's watching the movie City Slickers at the theater. I've never actually seen this movie. I've heard of it before. It's starring Billy Crystal, Jack Palance. I actually think Jack Palance won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, I believe, for this film. And Gary is talking about a particular scene in this movie where Curly and Mitch, so Mitch played by Billy Crystal and Curly played by Jack Palance, part of the story is basically Mitch is like a city guy working his way up in the corporate world, I think, and then they do this excursion out to like the West into the countryside, which is where they meet Curly. Hilarity ensues. Well, there's this scene where Curly and Mitch branch off. They're trying to go find this stray cattle, and they're talking with each other, conversing, and Curly asks Mitch, "Do you know what the secret of life is?" And Mitch responds, "Well, okay, why don't you just tell me? I don't really know." And Curly says, "It's this right here." And Mitch is like, "What, your finger?" And he's like, "No. One thing. That's the secret of life. You can have any one thing you want." And Mitch says, "Well, let me ask you, Curly, what's the one thing?" And Curly says, "Well, that's the thing that you have to figure out." That's what Curly says. You stick to that and everything else don't mean shit. But the hard part is figuring out what your one thing is. So Gary continues on here in this introductory chapter. He goes on to tell about how he hires a coach. He started this realty company. And the coach tells him, "Okay, you have 14 positions that need new faces. You got to hire 14 people." And Gary says, "Well, Jesus had 12 disciples." And the coach says, "Well, you need 14. Jesus had 12 disciples, but you need 14 people to fill these positions. You just got to have it if you want this company to go to the places that you want to go." So Gary actually steps down as CEO at this point, and he made finding those 14 people his singular focus. And at the conclusion of that and finding the 14 people, he said that within 3 years, his company had 40% growth year over year for almost a decade. And he kind of uses this as the starting off point for this whole one thing philosophy. And there's a quote here, what's the one thing you can do this week such that by doing it, everything else would be easier or unnecessary? And this is kind of like the base question that we should be asking ourselves when we're trying to find our one thing. Because there's lots of things out there, but what's the one thing that you can do that makes everything else easier by completing that thing? That's the question that we should all be asking each other, Gary says. And Gary says that he noticed whenever success varied, his focus varied too. So whenever there was time periods where success was very spotty, it's like, oh yeah, like we accomplished this, but then we didn't hit these targets. Well, their focus was wavering. It was never on one thing. So he's kind of starting to think, hey, there's kind of a correlation here. So where most people kind of go big and try to accomplish tons of things, Gary and the company went small. So why are some people better with time? They make getting to the heart of things the heart of their approach. They go small. They ignore everything else. So instead of having this big plate of things to do, you have a small plate with like one thing to do. And you ignore all the things you could do with what you should do. Narrow your focus. You don't want to spread yourself thin because you only have so much time and energy. I mean, think about it, guys. Like me, as far as coding and developing, there's only like certain times of the day where I feel most productive at that. And it's usually not late in the day. Late in the day, I'm winding down. I'm reading. I can do an episode of this later in the day, but for developing, like actually looking at code and stuff, I need to do that earlier in the day because that's when I have like I'm most cognizant and have my most energy. You don't want to spread yourself thin though, because doing too much, and I've done this, totally have done this, you do too much, leads to stress, long hours, sleepless nights. I mean, there's been things just within the past like year or two that I've had to scale back on because, again, I was just doing too much. And I knew I had to refocus on the certain things that really mattered to me. So Gary talks about this domino effect, and there's another book, I forget the author, but the book is titled The Compound Effect, which is essentially like where you work on things that gain a momentum that eventually snowball into like a huge payoff at the end. And that's kind of similar to what Gary talks about here with the domino effect, in that he talks about this story of Domino Day in Netherlands. November 13th, 2009, there was a world record domino fall. All these dominoes, they set a world record, and tons of energy is released in this world record domino fall. And each standing domino represents a small amount of potential energy, but the more you line up, the more energy you accumulate. And there was a scientist, Lauren Whitehead, who said that a single domino can bring down a domino that is 50% larger than it. 50% larger than it. So what ends up happening is you have a geometric progression versus a linear progression, as far as if you were to continue this 50% trend. And in the book, they explain, there's actually a nice chart. Let me go to that page in the book that shows you what can be achieved with this domino effect. This is basically, guys, what we're getting at here. Look at like the size of the dominoes, how much it increases. That's a geometric progression, I think, is what Gary's getting at here. And he goes on to say, okay, your first domino is going to be 2 inches tall, but by the 18th domino, considering that each subsequent domino is 50% bigger, by the 18th domino, it's going to be as tall as the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The 23rd will be as tall as the Eiffel Tower, the 31st, Mount Everest, and the 57th will almost reach to the moon. So the progression starts off really, really slow until it's moving too fast to stop. So it looks like this. It's a exponential. It's an exponential curve. Goes slowly, gradually, then suddenly shoots up. Whereas a linear progression is like one by one. You go up one by one like that. But we're not talking about that. See, when you focus on your one thing, it's more like a geometric progression. Yeah, it takes a while for it to get moving, but then once it's moving, it's too fast to stop. So you want to create that domino effect in real life. Whack away at the lead domino until it falls. Then you whack away at the second domino. It's going to be maybe a little bit tougher because it's a little bit bigger. But you whack away at that one. Hey, now you've got this other slightly bigger one. You whack away at that one, this other slightly bigger one. Success builds on success. It's sequential. It's not simultaneous. And I love that quote. Gradually, then suddenly. And that's how I've noticed, like, some of my breakthroughs have been not a lot happen, not a lot's happening. Like, I'm struggling with certain things right now, mentally, physically, spiritually, then all of a sudden, suddenly it takes off. Just from putting the work in before. Next, Gary talks about how success leaves clues, and you can see these clues in other companies. Successful companies have one product or service that they are known for, like KFC or Starbucks, Coors Light, or Coors and the beer company. You know, they do beer. Apple. Now, see, Apple has many things, but they've had one thing that exists, one thing that's been their focus, and that has transitioned to another one thing, like the iMacs that I remember, like in elementary school, with the weird colored background, weird colored rear of them that looked really kind of funky. And then you had, the iPad or iPod, and then the iPad, and now you have Apple Music now. And they've had many one things, but they focused on those things. Whenever those things have come out, that's been their like sole focus. Star Wars, the merchandise, Gary talks about how the merchandise of Star Wars here, let me see if I can pull this up. The merchandise of Star Wars dwarfs what they get in from the box office. It's almost like double. It was crazy when I was reading this. $10 billion from toys, $4.3 billion from the movies. So it's like double that. Crazy. And it's not just one thing. It could be one person making the difference. And I remember, if you guys have played the video game Half-Life and Half-Life 2, like the very first scene, like right when you're starting the game, and there's that character G-Man, and he says to Gordon, the right man in the wrong place can make all the difference in the world. And there's not a lot of lone wolves in success. So successful people can focus on one thing, but they've often had, it's not been them alone. It's been one person or like a small group of people that have helped them along the way. Like Walt Disney had his brother, was it his brother, Roy Disney? Yeah, his brother Roy, businessman, banker, got him work at an art studio when he was really young. Sam Walton got a loan from his father-in-law, helped start his first store. Albert Einstein had Max Planck, or Max Talmud was his first mentor, introduced him to some key texts. Nobody's a lone wolf in this. Nobody is self-made. So it could be one person. So it could also be one passion or one skill. One intense emotion or skill shines through. whether that's coding or shooting a three in basketball or being a really good passer, right? I mean, look at Tom Brady in the NFL. What's like one skill? Okay, yeah, he's a quarterback and he's athletic, but he's very good at fourth quarter comebacks or in the playoffs. That's like his top skill. Passion for something leads to a disproportionate amount of time on it, which then leads to that skill being more developed, which then leads to you liking it more, and then leads to more time being spent on that passion. And then it just, again, snowballs and snowballs and snowballs. Excuse me. So it's not just one thing, one person, one passion, one skill. It could be one life. One whole life can beget all of these things, like Gary talks about Bill Gates. He had one person, Paul Allen, his co-founder. He wrote one letter to this guy, Ed Roberts, at, let me see if I can find the page. Result of one letter they sent to one person, Ed Roberts, giving them a shot to write code for one computer, the Altair 8800. They did one thing with this computer, which is basically develop and sell basic interpreters for it. And then that snowballed into Microsoft. And now they have one foundation where they do all of these things for the world and for other people who take part in the foundation. But it all starts from one thing. Opportunities abound, possibilities are endless. And we are dealing now with way more than our ancestors had to deal with on a daily basis. You think back to early humans, it was just surviving, finding food, shelter. Like the base hierarchy, like on the hierarchy of needs, we just need a base, like at the base, food, water, shelter. There's choices everywhere, and it's the paradox of choice. Too many choices paralyzes you into not making a decision. But once you come to a decision on what your one thing is, it makes everything else easier. But it's not easy. Explaining it is the easy part, but buying in, that's the tough part. Putting it in practice, that's the tough part. And that's the introduction to the one thing, guys. Next week, or next episode, I should say, we're going to talk about the lies they misled and derail us with. Moving on to part 1 of the one thing. Thank you guys so much. We won't do maybe I will do a blog post. Keep an eye out on the blog. Maybe I will get a blog post to you guys, maybe detailing a story of mine relating to the one thing and my life. But I appreciate you guys listening this far. If this is your first time on Chee-Tash, go check out 1984. We just finished that series. Or go back to With Winning in Mind if you like these sort of books, or The Four Agreements, or The Alchemist, or hell, the first book we ever did, Man's Search for Meaning. We're trying to build this out and include as many books as we can on this channel. So I really appreciate you guys sticking with me this far. Let me know if you have any questions, comments down below, and I'll see you guys next episode. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.